This morning from Rome, Cardinal Francis George of Chicago. Your Eminence, welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you, David. Good morning.
I want to begin by asking you what you think Pope Francis can do right away that will define his papacy.
I think what he's doing now, that is, the style is the substance. And while they're small gestures, they indicate an attitude towards reality and towards the governance of the church that is very important in the long run. Secondly, what he really has to do is to make some important decisions about who are going to be his closest collaborators as he moves forward in his papacy.
There's the administration of the church. There is the sexual abuse scandal. What is probably foremost on the minds of Catholics in this country is, what does he mean to America? What does a pope from the Americas mean to the United States, particularly with a growing Latino population here?
Well, I think you said that very well, David. He means very much to the Latino population because even though many priests in the United States have learned Spanish to take care of a growing number of Spanish-speaking parishioners in the first generation at least, it's never quite the same to know the language as it is to know the culture. So he comes from the culture with the language, and that will be a source of great encouragement, I'm sure, for all of us, but especially for them. Beyond that, for the universal church, it means that we are global, truly, in fact as well as in intentionality. And so the crossing of the water to the Americas is a very historic moment, isn't it?
How he speaks about America is interesting as well. I can remember being a young reporter in the early 90s covering Pope John Paul II's visit to Denver with a youth group from New Mexico at the time when I was covering him, and seeing what a beloved figure he was there with President Clinton, of course, and more beloved even than his successor, Pope Benedict. What, in your judgment, as you know this Pope, can he, should he do to cultivate that relationship with this country?
Well, I was a very young bishop at the time, Bishop of Yakima in Washington State, and that was the first time I went to a World Youth Day with a whole lot of young people who had sold tacos endlessly in order to afford a chartered bus. And I was very deeply moved by it because they were. And I saw the way in which it transformed their lives. It had a huge impact on that small diocese in central Washington State, a rural diocese, when they returned home. But Pope Benedict was not as extroverted, obviously. He was a very shy man, a good man, a kind man, but he had difficulty showing that in public. So used was he to talking to books as much as to people. And this man is a pastor. First and foremost, he spent all his life being close to people, especially the poor. First of all, close to his own brothers in his own religious society, and then also to the people that he served in a very large diocese, Buenos Aires, in very difficult times. So he's a man of integrity, and that shines through. Even when he has to say this isn't what Christ wants, he says it apparently in a way that people can at least hear it, even if they don't agree with it. And that's an important pastoral note that I hope we'll all learn from in the years to come.
As a management matter, as a crisis management matter, what does Pope Francis do to come to terms with sexual abuse in the church that begins to close the chapter for the church?
Well, I can't close that chapter. None of us can, as long as there are victims, because you have to accompany them if they're willing to be accompanied. Some of them have such deep hurt that they can't trust the church to accompany them, but we have to keep doing that. As far as the scandal itself, everyone that we know of who has done this, whether bishop or priest, is out of public ministry and will remain out. That was because we had to change the law to do that, and it took some time. He supports that. And then we have to be sure that it won't happen again as much as we possibly can, and then stay with the victims. But the structures are in place now. The Code of Canon Law has been changed. The thing is that every time there's a new report, then everything happens yesterday instead of 20 or 30 years ago, which is often the case now.
There's the issue, I think, for a lot of American Catholics of the impact that Pope Francis can have on cultural and political debates in America. Gary Bauer, the evangelical leader in the United States, wrote something for USA Today this week that caught my attention, and I'll share it with our audience. He writes, "As an evangelical, I was delighted that the last two popes were moral and theological giants, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Introduced a new evangelical period for the Catholic Church, an era in which the Catholic Church offered a confident rebuttal to the false promises of the secular world." How would you like to see Pope Francis influence American political debates? And we have so many of them now, whether it's abortion or gay marriage. How would you like to see that impact?
I think he simply has to preach the gospel and then do it in a way that is accessible, and the Holy Spirit makes the impact, we believe. Conversion of heart and mind is not something any pope or any preacher can do. It depends upon God's grace. But you have to keep preaching the gospel and do it with integrity, and he'll certainly do that. You're preaching it now in a context where, in a sense, you could say there is no God and Freud is his prophet. So for the sake of sexual liberation, we're willing to let a lot of other liberties go. And I'm not sure we realize what's going on. I think he'll help us to realize it better, and we'll see what happens. We can only trust that the Lord is still with his people and loves the world that his Son died to save.
But, Your Eminence, isn't that part of the struggle? What you're speaking about is preaching from the Gospels. So many Catholics in this country see that tension between church doctrine and their own life experience, their own consciences that are leading them in a different direction. Whether there's a majority of Catholics in America who support gay marriage, those who call for a greater role for women in the church, who are less opposed to abortion or even contraception. How does he resolve that tension?
Well, I'm not sure you can resolve it when it's a matter of principle. All those issues weren't around 50 years ago. What has happened to our culture that suddenly these become cultural imperatives? And in history, when you take a look at the societies that come and go and countries come and go, when the chips are down, people will always go with their society, usually, not always, and those that don't are the minority very often. What we want to do is to create a society through dialogue that isn't quite as much at odds with the gospel of Jesus Christ as it seems ours has become, at times at least. So the phenomenon you're talking about is not new. Again, however, the church is universal, and so, you know, we have to stay with the entire church, and we have to stay with categories that aren't cultural. Conservative and liberal are the categories